Eyes sewn shut by outlaws as punishment for looking. A cowboy cut the thread and gave her daylight. The needle they used was a sail needle. I know because I found it in the dirt afterward, still threaded. Heavy thing, meant for canvas or leather, not for what they'd done with it. I won't say more about that, not yet. I'm going to tell this the way I remember it, which is not neat, and I apologize for that in advance. Memory doesn't organize itself for a listener. It comes back in pieces, some of them sharp enough to cut you, some of them blurred at the edges like a photograph left out in the rain. I've carried this for 31 years. Certain parts of it are worn smooth from being turned over so many times. Others I've never touched. I'm going to try to touch some of those today. The year was 1882. I was 43 years old, and I'd been working the Platte River stretch of the Union Pacific right-of-way since the previous March, hauling timber by mule team out of the Laramie Hills for the bridge crews. Seasonal work. The kind of work a man takes when he's got no particular place to be and no particular reason to hurry there. I'd been that kind of man for a long time. Since my wife Eleanor died of cholera in '76 and took our 2-year-old boy with her, I'd been that kind of man, moving with the work, sleeping in bunkhouses when they had them, in the open when they didn't. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you so you understand the condition of a man when he rides up on something like what I rode up on. I was 3 days out from the timber camp at Elk Mountain, pushing south with a light wagon, no timber, just the mules and myself, and a load of tools the bridge foreman wanted back. It was October. The high country had already gone cold and the plains were starting to catch up. Sky the color of a pewter plate all day, that flat gray that means serious weather is thinking about you from a distance. I had a bedroll, a week of supplies, and a Colt revolver I'd owned since the war that I trusted more than most people I'd known. I came down off a low ridge into a creek drainage, and that's when I smelled the smoke. Not campfire smoke. Camp smoke has a social smell to it, coffee, maybe meat, green wood that someone is fighting with. This was the particular smell of a fire that has already done its work and gone cold. Char and wet ash, the smell of something finished. I tied the mules to a cottonwood and went forward on foot. There were 4 wagons. One of them was burned to the axles. The others were ransacked, their loads scattered, flour sacks split open, a barrel staved in, bolts of calico run out into the dirt like someone had just grabbed one end and walked. Harness cut. Mules gone. This was a freight outfit, maybe 3 or 4 families moving goods, possibly settlers heading to the Utah Territory. Whoever did this had done it fast and professionally, which told me it wasn't Ute or Arapaho. This was white work, organized work, the kind that has a market at the other end of it. The bodies were the freighters, 3 men and a boy maybe 14. I won't describe what had been done to them. I stood there for a long moment in that creek bottom with the wind coming off the ridge above me, carrying that cold pewter sky with it, and I said a kind of prayer that I don't know the proper words to, the kind a man assembles for himself out of silence and whatever certainty he has left. Then I heard her. Not a cry, not a word, a sound between a breath and a moan, very low, coming from behind the burned wagon. I went around it and she was there. She was sitting up against the rear wheel of the second wagon with her knees pulled to her chest and her hands in her lap, and the first thing I saw was that her eyes were closed. I thought she was unconscious. Then I saw the thread, black thread, coarse, the kind you'd use for harness work, and I understood what I was seeing and I stopped walking. I had to stop for a moment. My heart did something I can only describe as a kind of lurch, like a step you thought was there that isn't. They had sewn her eyelids shut, both of them, 4 stitches each, pulling the upper lid down tight to the lower. The thread was dark with dried blood at the edges. Her face was white as alkali under the bruising, her left cheekbone was swollen, her lip split and sealed. She was maybe 25. She had dark hair, half down from what had been a braid, and she was wearing a dress that had started the day as pale blue. I came closer and I said quietly, "I'm here, I'm going to help you." She didn't flinch. She'd already used up everything that flinching requires. She said, "Are you one of them?" Her voice was steady. That steadiness hit me harder than the crying would have. She'd been sitting there, blind in that creek bottom, with 4 dead men somewhere nearby, and she'd organized herself into steadiness. Her hands in her lap were not shaking. I said, "No, I work timber for the railroad, I'm alone." A pause, then she said, "Do you have a knife?" I said I did. She turned her face toward me then, toward my voice, and she said, "Then do it carefully." I knelt in the dirt in front of her. up close like that I could see the detail of it more clearly than I wanted to. The needle had gone through the very edge of the lid, close enough to the lash line that whoever did it had some knowledge of the operation. This wasn't a man improvising. This was a man who knew what would hold and what would tear. The intent had been to keep her blind without destroying the eye itself, so she would live with it, so she would spend the rest of her days knowing that what she'd seen could be done and had been done to her. I took the smallest blade on my folding knife, the one I used for splicing, and I got the tip of it under the first stitch at the corner of her left eye. My hands were not entirely steady. I will admit that. She felt the small pressure of it and her jaw tightened, but she held absolutely still. "Tell me your name," she said. I told her Thomas Calloway. She said, "Thomas Calloway, I am trusting you with my eyes." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I know that." I cut the first stitch, then the second. The thread pulled free in a thin, dark line. I moved to the right side and did those 4, and then it was done, and I sat back on my heels and said, "Open slowly." She opened her eyes. She blinked several times. The light was gray and flat, which was a mercy bright sun would have been agony. Her eyes were brown, very dark, almost black. She moved them left and right. Then she looked at me. I don't know how to tell you what it was like to be looked at in that moment. I was a weathered, plain-featured man with a week's beard and a canvas jacket that hadn't been washed since Laramie. I was not anyone's idea of a rescue. But she looked at me with those dark eyes for a long time without saying anything, and then she said, "You have kind hands." I said I didn't know about that. She said, "I know about that." Her name was Nora Vasquez. Her husband had been one of the 3 freighters. He was the one I'd found farthest from the wagons he'd run or tried to. She told me this without much inflection, the way a person states a thing they've already finished grieving in some interior room they've closed. She'd been 2 years married. She was expecting their first child, though it was early yet and she'd told almost no one. She told me because it mattered for the ride. I said the nearest town was Rawlins, about 2 days south if we pushed. I said I had supplies enough for 2 people if we were careful. I said she could ride the wagon seat. She looked at the burned-out wagons, the scattered flour, the open sky. She said, "All right." We buried the men. I didn't have a shovel. I had a short-handled camp pick, and the ground was hard with the first cold of the season. It took most of the afternoon. Nora worked alongside me. I didn't ask her to. She picked up a piece of broken wagon board and used the flat end to move the loosened dirt. She didn't say much. When we got to her husband, she put her hand on his chest for a moment before we covered him, and that was the extent of what she showed outwardly. I looked away. We made camp in the creek bottom that night. I built a fire and made coffee and heated the beans I had, and she sat close to the fire with a blanket around her and ate slowly. Her face in the firelight, the swollen cheek, the cut lip, the thin red lines at the edge of each eyelid where the stitching had been. I looked at all of it and looked away and looked again. The way you do when something is hard to stop looking at, not because it's ugly, but because it's asking something of you. I said, "Does it hurt, your eyes?" She said, "Like grit, but I can see." I said, "We'll get a doctor in Rawlins." She nodded and stared into the fire for a while. Then she said, "How long do you think they'd been gone when you came?" I'd thought about that. The fire was cold. The bodies were cold. I said maybe 6 hours, maybe 8. She said, "I heard them leave. I heard the horses, and then I heard nothing for a very long time." She said it without self-pity, purely as a statement of fact. 6 to 8 hours. Sitting blind against the wheel of that wagon in the gathering cold of an October afternoon in Wyoming, listening to absolute silence where violence had been. I said, "You held on." She looked at me across the fire. She said, "I decided to." I slept with one ear up that night. The mules were restless. They'd smelled the burning. And twice I got up to check the picket line. The second time I came back and sat down on my bedroll and looked at Nora asleep, and I thought about the sail needle in the dirt and about the deliberateness of what had been done, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Not exactly anger, something colder and more purposeful than anger. The old soldier waking up. We left at first light. The ride to Rawlins took 2.5 days. The weather held, cold but clear, the grass brown and flattened by the first hard frosts, the sky opening up into that enormous Wyoming blue that makes you feel both very small and very specific, like a pin in a map. Nora sat on the wagon seat beside me, and we talked, sometimes and sometimes didn't. She wasn't a woman who filled silence for the sake of it. I'd been alone long enough that I'd lost the habit of requiring that. She asked me about Alina on the second afternoon after I'd mentioned her in passing. I told her more than I'd told anyone in years. The cholera summer, the boy. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she sat quiet for a bit, and then she said, "You've been carrying that a long time on your own." I said yes. She said, "That's too long for a man like you." I didn't know what to say to that. She told me about her family. Her father had come from Sonora with the silver miners. Her mother was from a farm family in Missouri. They'd met in Santa Fe, and she'd grown up between two languages and two skies. She'd followed her husband north because he had a contract with a freight company in Salt Lake, and she'd believed in the contract. She said this without blame or regret, just the facts of how a life assembles itself around the decisions you make. On the third morning, the mules picked up their pace. They could smell town, water, grain. The smokes of Rawlins were visible from 6 miles off. Nora straightened on the seat and put her hair back properly for the first time, and I watched her do it, her hands moving with a kind of automatic competence. And I thought, this woman has been grieving for 3 days at a steady walk because that was the pace available to her, and she hasn't once asked me to slow down for it. We came into Rawlins on a Wednesday, mid-morning. I took her directly to the doctor, a man named Stroud who'd been an Army surgeon. He examined her eyes, cleaned the puncture points, told her there was no damage to the eye itself. The stitching had been done, he said, with a peculiar precision. He looked at me when he said that and then looked away. He wanted to keep her overnight for observation. I said I'd come back in the morning. I went to the marshal's office and made my report. 2 deputies went out that afternoon for the bodies and whatever evidence remained. The marshal said the outfit I'd described, the sail needle, the organization of the attack, matched a crew that had been working the freight routes since summer. He said they'd get them. He said it the way lawmen say things when they're not certain. I got a room at the boarding house and washed and ate a proper meal, and felt the 3 days of driving settle into my back and shoulders all at once. In the morning, I went back to Stroud's. Nora was sitting up in the examination room with better color in her face, the swelling in her cheek starting to go down. Stroud said she was fine. He said to her, not to me, that she should rest for at least a week before traveling. She said, "I have nowhere to go." She said it flat like an inventory. Her husband was dead. His employer in Salt Lake didn't know her. Her father had died 2 years ago. Her mother was in Missouri, but they'd been estranged over the marriage. Her mother hadn't approved of the freight business, the moving around. She had money in her husband's coat pocket that I'd recovered from the creek bottom and handed to Stroud, which amounted to $11 and some change. She was 2 months along with a child she hadn't yet told her mother-in-law about. I stood there in the doorway of the examination room. I said, "The timber camp at Elk Mountain has a cook's cabin. The cook left in September and they haven't replaced him. I can talk to the foreman." She looked at me. I said, "It's not much. It's 1 room with a stove and a good roof. The camp has 20 men who'd be glad of a cook and there's wages in it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you asking me to do this for my sake or for yours?" I said I didn't entirely know. She looked at me for another moment, that same steady look, the dark eyes that had seen a good deal more than they'd asked to. And then something in her face changed, just slightly, not a smile exactly, but the precursor to one, and she said, "That's an honest answer." She came to the timber camp. I won't pretend it was simple. 20 rough men in a logging camp in the Wyoming high country, and a young widow among them carrying a dead man's child in October. There was talk. Some of it was the kind of talk men do when they don't mean much by it, and some of it was the kind that requires a response. I provided the response twice in the first week, once with words and once with my hands, and after that the talk became the respectful kind, the kind that acknowledges a situation without presuming to judge it. Nora cooked. She was good at it, efficient, and not precious about it, the same way she was not precious about anything. She learned the men's preferences quickly, and she didn't mother them, which is what they needed. She ran that kitchen with a quiet authority, and nobody tested it twice. She and I talked in the evenings when the day's work was done, sometimes at the kitchen table over the last of the coffee, sometimes outside if the weather allowed. She asked me questions about the work, the timber grading, the mule teams, the bridge cruise down on the Platte, and she listened to the answers properly, the way a person does when they actually want to know and not just when they want the appearance of wanting to know. I'd forgotten that existed. I'd been around men so long I'd forgotten that a person could sit across a table from you, and actually hear what you said. The child made itself known in December. She'd told me before she told anyone else in November, just us in the kitchen with the stove going and the wind coming off the ridge. She told me because I already knew, and because I think she wanted one person in that camp to know before the fact became visible. I said I was glad. I meant it. The foreman, a big Norwegian named Halstad, came to me in late November and said that the camp situation with Nora was getting complicated in terms of propriety, and that he thought we ought to sort it out, and he meant by this that we ought to get married. He said it in the direct Norwegian way, like a matter of logistics, and I appreciated that. I thought about it for 3 days. On the 4th day, I went to the kitchen and waited until after supper when the men had gone, and it was just the two of us, and I said what I'd been thinking. I said I knew the situation had built itself around necessity, and that necessity wasn't the same as choice, and that she'd had her choice taken from her enough times in recent months, and I wasn't going to be another thing that happened to her. I said if she wanted to move on in the spring to Missouri, to Salt Lake, anywhere else, I would help her do it with whatever I had. I said if she wanted to stay, for whatever reasons she had and not the reasons that were convenient for me, I wanted that. I said I'd been alone for 6 years, and I'd made a kind of peace with it, and then I'd come down into that creek bottom and found her, and I hadn't been at peace since. Not because I was unhappy, because I'd remembered something I thought I'd finished remembering. She was quiet for a long time. The stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the pines on the ridge with that high sound that is just below music. She said, "You found me in the worst day of my life." I said yes. She said, "And you've been careful with me ever since." I said I'd tried to be. She looked at me across the table. She reached out and put her hand flat on the back of my hand on the table between the coffee cups, and she kept it there. Her palm was warm from the stove work. She said, "Thomas, you gave me back my eyes, and you gave me a room and a stove and 20 bad-tempered lumbermen, and you have been the steadiest thing in my life since October. I am not in this kitchen because I had nowhere else to go. I am here because here is where you are." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say that wouldn't be smaller than what she'd said. She said, "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" I said yes. She said, "Good," and turned my hand over and held it. We were married by the circuit preacher in January, in the cook's cabin, with Halstead and 3 of the less frightening lumbermen as witnesses. Nora was 5 months along by then, showing clearly, and she stood in that kitchen in a dress she'd made from calico she'd ordered from Rawlins, and she looked at me during the ceremony with those dark eyes in a way that I can only tell you made me feel like the right man. Not a better man than I was, or a different man, the right one. For her in that place at that time, I had not felt like the right anything in a very long time. Our son was born in March. We named him Elias after her grandfather. He came into the world in that cook's cabin in the timber camp on a night when there was 2 feet of new snow on the ground, and the pines were cracking with the cold, and he was loud and healthy and red-faced. And when I held him the first time, I thought about the boy I'd lost in '76 with the particular grief that doesn't cancel itself out, but just adds to what you carry. And I thought that carrying things isn't the same as being crushed by them. Halstead gave us a section of land at the edge of the company's holdings, a gesture of the Norwegian sort, practical and without ceremony. We built a house the following summer. Proper house, 2 rooms, stone chimney, a real wood floor. I built it with my own hands and 2 men from the camp who came on their days off for the work and the whiskey I provided. Nora mixed the chinking for the chimney herself, up on a ladder in September, 7 months after Elias was born, and I stood below her, and I thought about the sail needle in the dirt, and about how far a person can travel from one moment to another if they're given the chance to travel at all. She knew I thought about the men who'd done it. She never asked me not to think about it. What she did was this. When she could see me going quiet in the particular way that meant I was back in that creek bottom, she would find a reason to be near me. She'd come stand next to me at whatever I was doing at the workbench, at the fence line, at the kitchen table, and she'd put her hand on my arm or my shoulder. Not to stop me thinking, just to be there, just so I knew I wasn't back there alone. The marshal's wire came in the spring of '83. They'd caught the outfit in Nevada, 4 men, indicted on 7 counts of murder and robbery going back to the summer before. The wire was addressed to me as the reporting witness. I read it and folded it and put it in the tin box where I kept the marriage certificate and Elias' birth record, and I told Nora, and she nodded slowly and said, "Good," and that was the extent of it. Some things close and some things don't. The ones that close, you know it because the weight of them changes, not gone. Just different, carried differently. I still have the sail needle. I know that sounds strange. I went back to that creek bottom in the spring after the camp broke for the season, rode out alone, told Nora I was checking on the mule pasture, which was not entirely untrue because the pasture was in that direction. I found the needle in the dirt where I'd last seen it, half buried by the winter. I picked it up and I rode back and I put it in the tin box, with the marriage certificate and the birth record. I'm not sure why, maybe so the whole thing is in one place. The worst of it and the best of it in the same box. That seems about right to me. Nora asked me once, years later. Elias was maybe 7 or 8. We'd had a second boy by then named Martin, and we were on the porch of the house in the evening, the sun going down behind the Medicine Bow Range and turning the sky colors that still feel impossible to me after all the sunsets I've seen. She asked me what I'd thought when I first came around that wagon and saw her. I said I'd thought I needed to be careful, that I needed to do the next thing right. She said just that. I said I'd also thought that whatever had happened to her was the worst thing I'd seen a person survive while still sitting up. She smiled at that, the smile she had that started slow and then arrived all at once. She said, I was sitting up because I'd decided to, I told you that. I said she had. She said, and do you know why I'd decided to? I said I'd always wondered about that. She turned and looked at me with those dark eyes in the evening light and she said, because I thought someone would come. We sat there as the sky went from orange to rose to that deep clear purple that comes just before the stars. Martin was inside sleeping. Elias was somewhere in the pasture beyond the fence, doing whatever 7-year-old boys do in pastures at dusk. The Medicine Bow Range sat out there in the last light, big and permanent and indifferent in the way that mountains are, which is not actually indifferent at all. It's just a different kind of care, the kind that doesn't require you to deserve it. Nora's hand was on my arm. She'd been putting her hand on my arm for 11 years by then, and it still felt like something. That's the whole of it, I think. A sail needle, a creek bottom, a woman who decided to wait because she thought someone would come. And I came, and that turned out to be enough. I don't know what makes a man the right one for a thing. I don't think it's anything he particularly earns in advance. I think sometimes you arrive at the moment that requires you and you're either equal to it or you're not. And if you are, and if there's a woman in that moment who is equal to it herself, well, then the two of you have made something out of nothing, out of the worst kind of nothing, and that's not a small thing. That's not a small thing at all.